Thank you, Jody. And I guess to complement what Jody presented, I was asked to talk about managing diseases in the seed crop, particularly diseases that might be seed-borne. Jody mentioned the issue of scouting and keeping an eye out, and if you do see evidence of a problem starting, what are your measures for trying to prevent diseases either from coming in or from spreading and developing further in your field? So that's the emphasis I'll be placing today. And just so you know, that book from Canada, I got 3 more copies in April when I was up at the University of Guelph from the former president of the CPS. When she told me they were out of print, I immediately bought what I could with the cash I had on hand in my wallet while I was there. So I have one that I could auction off and raise money for OSA or something. There we go, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so as Jody mentioned, and obviously you've heard the impact of seed-borne diseases. So in addition to these pathogens potentially affecting the yield that you get out of your seed crop, they can obviously affect the quality of that seed. The seed can be infected if it's a seed-borne pathogen. The seed germination and vigor sometimes can be affected. Some diseases don't affect seed germination and vigor, and others do. And that, from a seed company perspective, is important in terms of what they can do with that pathogen. And of course, you as a grower do not want to be spreading new races to areas where they aren't established, or the company that's buying the seed from you certainly doesn't want to be responsible for that. So this is a big concern from a seed company's perspective. So this is all established stuff, but it is helpful to think about disease management in your seed crop from, I tend to divide into 3 sort of categories of management strategies. One is cultural type practices, the way you grow the crop. The second is a chemical type of management practice. And just because you're organic doesn't mean you aren't necessarily using stuff that works in a chemical format. So certified organic products are still chemicals. And there are some pretty effective options out there and some not very effective options. And a lot of it has to do with how you work with these products. And seed treatments, as Jody's mentioned, even things like bleach, that's a chemical that you're putting on your seed to treat the seed. And then, of course, disease resistance. Now, in general production, if you're not a seed grower, there can sometimes be very effective choices of resistant cultivars or less susceptible cultivars. The problem as a seed grower is often you're given a contract for a particular parent line or particular OP or whatever it might be. You don't have a choice on the resistance of that parent line, that OP. And this is a real struggle. And I particularly sometimes deal with this in conventional production if they're doing hybrids. And let's say the hybrid has really good resistance to a wide range of races of downy mildew. The parent lines that go into that hybrid, often one of them has almost no resistance or only resistance to certain races and not others. And then as a grower, you're struggling to manage those races that that parent line is very susceptible to if it's established in your area. So this can be complicated and not necessarily a choice you have to deal with if that you're given a contract for certain lines. When I work with growers on trying to manage diseases in their seed crops, it's really helpful to recognize that the pathogen is a living organism. And just as we as living organisms have periods of our lives we're more susceptible or more prone to certain things, the same thing with the pathogens. They have certain stages in their life cycle where you are more likely to be effective in managing that pathogen than others. And this can vary widely because we're dealing with a complex and diverse set of pathogens from bacteria, viruses, nematodes, fungi. Even within one of those groups, there's a lot of variation in when these organisms are more vulnerable. I tend to try and think about it as what is the Achilles heel of that particular disease you're working with. And this is where, as Jody mentioned, information, that knowledge is really valuable to help you be more effective as a grower when you are dealing with the seed. One of the first things I do when I have to deal with a disease that I perhaps am not as familiar with is to read as much as I can of background information to know what has been determined about this organism, where is its Achilles heel in terms of our options for managing, both in conventional and organic production. And so I just drew a schematic up on the slide here of reminding us of what goes on when a pathogen establishes in your field. That field has to be inoculated from somewhere. Where does that inoculum come from? Is it coming from the stock seed that you planted? And of course, that's always something you hope doesn't happen, but it certainly does. I've run into that situation before. Is it blowing in from a neighboring field or your field or your neighbor's field? Is it something that's already present in the soil? These are all really important questions for you to think about managing that disease in the future or preventing it from coming in. And that pathogen, just because it lands on your crop, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause a problem. Just like seeds have to imbibe moisture to germinate, spores of a fungus have to imbibe moisture if they land on the leaf and germinate. And there's certain conditions that favor that, certain temperature ranges, durations of leaf wetness, humidity, and so on. And this is one of the reasons we tend to grow seed crops in the drier western states, because we have less humidity overall, and humidity tends to favor bacterial and fungal diseases. We could have a heck of a lot more seed production in the East Coast, Midwestern states if there wasn't humidity there, but it raises the risk of these diseases very significantly for fungi and bacteria. And that's the reason we tend to have a majority of seed production focused in the drier states. And then same thing, the infection and colonization, establishment, growth and reproduction of those pathogens on the crops all requires certain conditions that are favorable for that organism. Sometimes, unfortunately, those favorable conditions are exactly the same as the conditions that are favorable for the crop, but sometimes not so. And you can look at ways to maybe manipulate growing or where you grow certain things to try and get at that Achilles heel. Understanding how that pathogen is spreading. What's the risk of it spreading within your seed crop? What's the risk of it spreading to your next seed crop if you're growing a biennial and there's an overlap in the biennial crops? And this is a big problem with some of the seed crops I work on in vegetables, like carrot and onions. Biennial, there's usually multiple months of overlap. And what's the risk of a pathogen moving from this year's crop to next year's crop when they're overlapping by several months? Is it spread by wind? Is it spread by splashing water, irrigation? Is it spread by pruning tools or equipment that you use when you're walking through the field and handling things? And then you go and work in next year's crop that's just emerging. Are you potentially moving the pathogen along? And how's this pathogen surviving? So if you've had an outbreak in a field, what's the risk that this pathogen will be present on your farm through to next year? And those are really important questions to think about. And there's a wide variation in the answers to this depending on the disease. So when you have an outbreak of a pathogen in one of your seed crops, these are really important questions to ask yourself. Do I understand this life cycle of this organism, what the risks are, and where the Achilles heels are? Okay, so we'll take a step through those strategies for managing diseases in your seed crops. And I'm going to emphasize, for the most part, cultural practices, because in a certified organic production, that becomes the backbone of your disease management program. And it is too in conventional production, but certainly when you have fewer options in terms of certified organic chemicals, you really, really need to rely on solid cultural practices. There's no question, everyone knows why we rotate crops. Crop rotation is essential for so many reasons, and one of those is disease management, because many pathogens have a limited duration of survival in the soil or in the region. Pathogens that are not truly soil-borne, ones that really primarily infect the upper canopy and won't persist in the soil once those residues are broken down, those are the diseases that crop rotation is most effective against. And so if you know whether that pathogen you're dealing with is truly soil-borne or primarily foliar, you can get a good feel for, is a 2-year rotation or 3-year rotation going to be adequate? A disease like white rot, as Jody mentioned, which can sit in the soil for an extremely long time, rotation is not a very effective option. There's other things you have to look at. Eliminating alternative hosts. So what other hosts on your farm might also be a place where that pathogen could survive and spread and reproduce and so on. And those alternative hosts can vary widely from weeds. They might not be a crop. They could be weeds, so they could be certainly another crop you're growing. And then if you do have the pathogen established in your field, can you destroy that, destroy that inoculum? And we'll go through some of these in a little more detail. Something as simple as irrigation. Many, maybe perhaps not in Western Washington, Western Oregon, you don't always need to irrigate, but certainly if you're in a drier part of the states, many of you are irrigating. Your choice of irrigation system, obviously there's things like economics and practical logistical aspects that determine what sort of irrigation system you use, but they can have a very big influence on how rapidly a disease might establish in your field. Things like choice of drip irrigation versus overhead irrigation. Fungi and bacteria are notoriously rapidly spread by splashing water, many of them. And so certain pathogens are going to be much more problematic under overhead irrigation. I'll give you, as a good example, bacterial blight on carrot, as Jody mentioned. Bacteria are very, very quickly spread by overhead irrigation. Xanthomonas in carrot seed production is the most widely established disease in carrot seed production in the US. And as a result of this disease, about 60% or more of carrot seed production in Central Oregon has shifted to drip irrigation in an effort to try and manage this disease, because it's so endemic in our carrot seed production in the US now. And we have to do everything we can to try and keep the population down. And drip irrigation is expensive for growers to shift to, but it's been important economically enough to justify the cost. Planting practices. So we'll go through a few examples of that, but simple things like, do you have an option to change the orientation of the rows in the field? Why would you want to change the orientation of the rows in the field? If you're dealing with a disease that is favored by high humidity and your canopy, often in seed crops, gets pretty dense, what happens to airflow in the canopy? It's limited, which means a longer period of high humidity, more favorable, a longer window of susceptibility. If you change your road direction, and this is not always an option, but if you do have that ability into the predominant wind direction, it's remarkable how much quicker that canopy will dry out if your rows can be oriented into the primary wind direction versus perpendicular to the primary wind direction. I've been amazed in my own trials where we've inoculated. If I was trying to create disease to do the research and accidentally planted my rows into the primary wind, and then another trial close by perpendicular. The difference in disease pressure was remarkable. The same parent line, same inoculum and everything, but just simply because the airflow through those rows was much more effective when I had the rows oriented into the wind. So something as simple as that. It may not always work based on the topography of your ground and the lay of your land, but it can be a pretty effective option if you think about it. And this comes down to this whole issue of ventilation of seed crops. Brassica seed crops, as you know, can get pretty leggy, especially some of these open pollinated lines, and making sure your stake can tie your crop up well with, when you come through and tie it up. It not only helps keep the pods off the ground, it also helps improve the ventilation through the rows. Your fertility program, and I think this is maybe less of an issue in organics, but we see it quite a bit in conventional. It tends to be sometimes a tendency to over-fertilize. Soft, succulent, lush growth can be more susceptible to certain pathogens. Transplanting, making sure you have clean transplants and so on. And then your harvest practices, and we'll go through a few examples. And then geographic or regional locations. So I'll illustrate some of these. So with crop rotation, your rotation is only going to work if you recognize what are non-host crops or more resistant cultivars, or even antagonistic crops like biofumigation crops that you can use to help that might actually release synthetic and natural biofumigants like mustards. And how long you have to rotate. So what is an adequate rotation if you've got a disease in your field? This obviously is dependent on the host range of the pathogen. Jody mentioned Sclerotinia sclerotiorum, which causes white mold and is extremely common on a wide range of hosts. Has over 300 plant species it'll go to. So you start running into a limitation on what you might be able to rotate with. It doesn't affect monocots. So if you grow a cereal or something along the lines that's not susceptible, and you put it in that interval, extend your rotation interval out to 4 or 5 years, that can make a big difference. Is it, as I mentioned, is it foliar or is it soil-borne? Because soil-borne pathogens tend to be very persistent. They produce structures that allow them to survive in the soil for a long time, and a 2 or 3 year rotation often is not adequate for soil-borne diseases. Great example is in onions. We've been dealing with pink root, which is it's not a seed-borne pathogen, but where I see the worst cases of pink root in onion bulb crops is where growers have started to cut short on their rotation, down to 2 or 3 years. If they stick to 4 or 5 years, you tend to get a lot less severe pink root. And then, as I said, the resistance of the cultivar or the parent lines you're growing can influence the amount of inoculum that will build up and therefore the rotation that is needed. And also be aware of asymptomatic hosts. Jody mentioned black rot is one of the red alert diseases if you're a brassica grower, not just for vegetables, but also for canola and some of these other oilseed crops. Any of the brassicas are highly susceptible to black rot. And brassica weeds, and we all know we have quite a few of them around, can be carriers of the black rot pathogen, symptomatic and asymptomatically. So making sure weed control, if you're worried about black rot and you are doing brassica seed production, pay extra attention to brassica weeds in your region. And then, as I mentioned, alternative hosts that may be, in some cases, for example, certain rust pathogens have alternative hosts they go to in order to complete their life cycle. Do you understand if you have rust in your crop, does it have an alternative host? Is that host in your region or not? And I mentioned this issue of biennial seed crops or perennial seed crops becomes a lot more problematic because you're carrying that pathogen through that crop into the next season, and there's overlap from crop to crop. I'm going to give you one example, and as I went back through my slides and preparing for this, I realized this is not a good example because this virus is not seed-borne, but it's a good illustration of this issue of spatial and temporal isolation. So forgive me for using a non-seed-borne virus to illustrate this, but I think the principle is still the same. So Iris yellow spot virus is a relatively new disease to the US and to onion seed production, but over the last 10 to 15 years has become quite severe, and I have seen onion seed crops literally destroyed 2 to 4 weeks before harvest. So this is unfortunately one of those cases where Jody mentioned usually viruses are not that destructive. This is one of those that unfortunately can be very destructive. And you can see in this picture on the screen, the left-hand two pictures show the kinds of lesions that will develop on the seedscape. And those lesions can get very large. They're quite pretty if you want to look at the artistic side of the virus, these beautiful diamond-shaped lesions, but they can get very large. And then when that seed head starts to fill, it gets heavy. And if you have windy conditions, which is not uncommon, especially east of the Cascades, that seed head is heavy, the scape gets weak where those lesions can sometimes coalesce, and you see the right-hand picture, those seed stalks have fallen over, they've lodged. And then once the seed stalks lodge like that, the seed doesn't finish filling out. So you end up with a lot of unfilled seed, poor quality seed. That seed could maybe be sized out during the conditioning part of things, but you can get a very significant yield reduction. If you're hand harvesting your seed crop, it's not as bad. You can come and pick up that seed stalk and cut the umbel off. But a lot of onion seed crops are machine harvested, and those will not be picked up by the machine. And that's where we see literal wipeouts, 20 acres of an onion seed crop just under 2 weeks before it was supposed to be harvested. And this is pretty devastating. One of the problems with this virus is that even though it's not seed-borne, it is thrips-borne. So there's a picture in the bottom of onion thrips. Thrips tabaci is the vector for this virus. And we all know how difficult thrips are to control if you're growing in a dry, warm environment, particularly like Central Washington, Central Oregon. And this is the reason the virus has become very problematic. Onion seed production is biennial. We know that in some cases, like Allium fistulosum is grown as a perennial for seed production. That's Japanese bunching onion. You'll keep it in the ground for 2 or 3 years. In the spring, when those new shoots grow out, the thrips can survive over the winter on those shoots. And also in Allium cepa, the true onion, it survives through the winter, vernalizes over the winter, grows out in the spring. And I've gone into onion seed fields in January when the temperature had been down to single digits. You dig around in the neck of those plants that are surviving under the snow. You pull out an adult onion thrips in your hand, and it's not moving. But as soon as it warms up in your hand, it scurries off. So that's in single-digit temperatures. We know they're surviving through the winter. And if they're virilliferous, they will spread that virus in the spring, which is certainly the case. So this picture in the slide, the top right-hand corner of the slide, shows an aerial photo taken of an onion seed crop east of the Cascade Mountains. And you can see the dark, sort of brownish color is the area where the virus was most severe in terms of its symptoms and yield loss. And so it basically shows the direction of migration of the thrips from the field that's bare in this photo to where the onion seed crop. Now, what was in that field right next to this onion seed crop, you think? Last year's onion seed crop. So when that last year's onion seed crop was maturing, was at this stage, next year's, this seed crop that you see in the photo now had been planted and had emerged. So where did the thrips go when the seed crop is drying down? You have to dry it down to get the seed to mature. Thrips simply migrated over, carrying the virus with them. So this biennial overlap, this green bridge effect we talk about in plant pathology, is a very, very important factor when you're dealing with crops that are more than annual and carrying things through the season. So it's a spatial isolation that creates a green bridge, and it's a temporal isolation, a lack of temporal isolation for biennial or perennial crops that really creates a problem. This is the same virus, what you see here on this aerial infrared photo, red meaning healthy, brown is not healthy. So this was a center pivot irrigated bulb crop that was then shifted over to drip irrigation. And on the right-hand side of that image, there's a little block that says onion seed crop. That was an onion seed crop that I visited literally months before harvest, and it was severely infested with Iris yellow spot virus. Onion seed crops get harvested in late July, early August in Central Washington. It was drying down. The grower disked the field under because everything was falling over. It was 90% collapse of the seed stalks. Where did the thrips go? Right over to the bulb crop next door. And you can see that brown area right along adjacent to the onion seed crop. The thrips just carried the virus with them. So here you've got lots of green bridge effects. You've got overlapping biennial seed crops. You've got annual bulb crops right next to biennial seed crops. You've got volunteers. You've got autumn sown bulb crops. It's just, unfortunately, has resulted in iris yellow spot being a very difficult disease to manage, and it's had a big impact on onion seed production in central Washington. Okay, I beat that to death, hopefully, but that's a good lesson because this green bridge effect we run into very frequently. Destroying inoculum in the field. You're trying to remove that infested residue, the infected crop if it's still alive, or infested residue. And another aspect is when you harvest a seed crop, sometimes some of that seed shatters to the ground. And if that seed is infested or infected with the pathogen, that can be a source of inoculum and that seed grows the next season. So you want to think about this. And you're trying to prevent the soil-borne inoculum from establishing or reducing inoculum of soil-borne pathogens. One practice I've read about is burning stubble and debris. We've all heard the stories about grass seed crops that used to be burned. It's a banned practice now for many areas. Part of the reason it would be burned is to help kill off pathogens that are on the stubble. It was an extremely effective way of managing diseases in grass seed crops. But we know that for various reasons, environmental and others, it's not a good practice. But it has, the banning of burning for grass seed crops has resulted in a lot more difficulty for the grass seed industry for managing some of these diseases. I've even seen people talking about vacuuming fields. Now, this seems a little extreme, but perhaps if you've got a smaller scale field and you're dealing with limited production, heard people talking about going over and vacuuming up the inoculum. I was looking at a study down in Hermiston of ergot and grass seed production, where they came over with a vacuum and vacuuming the sclerotia that fell out of the heads of the grass seed crop to minimize inoculum that would go through to the next year of that perennial grass seed production. Fumigation, including biofumigation. For organic production, it's not uncommon for growers to use things like mustard green manure crops that provide a biofumigant effect. When that mustard manure crop gets broken up and incorporated into the soil, it releases a natural biofumigant and kills off inoculum and weed seed and sometimes some insect pests and so on. Soil solarization. Unfortunately, typically our climate up here in the Pacific Northwest is usually not warm enough. But in warmer states like Arizona or places like Israel, solarization can be quite effective against certain soil-borne pathogens. There's a limit to how much that heat will penetrate into the depth of the soil profile, and you have to have a lot of heat to really get any depth to that effect. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of one of the pathogens we work with quite a bit in spinach seed production, and leaf spot pathogens can be an issue in spinach seed production. There are two pathogens that we tend to see predominantly in spinach seed crops here in the Pacific Northwest. Cladosporium variabile, which causes cladosporium leaf spot, and Stymphalium botryoosum, which causes Stymphalium leaf spot. And you might say, well, why do I care which one I have? If I've got a leaf spot of my crop, I know I've got a foliar fungal pathogen, and both of them can be seed-borne. Well, it turns out that they have very, very different ways of surviving through to the next season, and that has important ramifications for management. When we were first working with these pathogens, when I started this job 13 years ago, and we were asked to address this disease, which was a big problem for our spinach seed growers, I was trying to find out how they were surviving through the year. And if any of you have looked at a spinach seed field after the crop's been harvested and you come back 2 months later in the winter, it's not uncommon to see a carpet of volunteers because you harvest a lot of seed, but some of it shatters to the ground when you windrow it and so on. And those volunteers, certainly in Western Washington and Western Oregon, they have no problem surviving our winters. They just don't get cold enough. Spinach is very cold hardy. What we discovered is that these volunteers, so this picture was taken on February 20th of 2002, and you can see those little spots I've circled. All of those spots turned out to be Cladosporium variabile. We never were able to find the Stymphalium leaf spot pathogen forming disease symptoms on the volunteers. It's not a cold-tolerant pathogen. It likes warm conditions. Cladosporium is very cold-tolerant. So we know if you let your volunteers persist in the field through the winter, you are building up Cladosporium inoculum for the next season. So kind of wondered, well, what's Stymphalium doing if it's not around on the leaf spots? Well, lo and behold, the closer I looked, besides the volunteers you see in these fields, you find these woody stem tissue. You see that picture on the right? Those are spinach seed crops don't get truly woody, but once they dry down, that stem tissue, which can be pretty thick, takes on a woody-like appearance. that tissue takes a long time to break down. And if those stem pieces stay on the surface of the soil, you see those, I've circled these tiny little pinhead-sized black spots. Each of those little black dots is a fungal fruiting body. Each of them will produce tens of thousands of spores in the spring. Now, what was interesting is I was never able to find those fungal fruiting bodies forming on residues that were buried or on the side of the residue that was in contact with the soil. So if you incorporate the residues after you harvest a spinach seed crop and minimize the amount of stalk tissue that stays on the top of the surface, you have significantly reduced the amount of inoculum or stemphyllium that will build up through that winter and release those spores in the next spring. So this is a close-up picture of those little black structures. I call them the Hershey's Kiss of Death for spinach. Each of those little structures you see on the top left picture, they look like a little Hershey's chocolate kiss. It's got a little tip to it. There's a tiny hole at the tip of that little structure. It's called a pseudothecium. In the spring, when the temperature warms up enough, inside each of those structures is it says a little sac in the bottom right-hand picture. That's a sac called an ascus. Each of those asci contains 8 spores, 8 ascospores. You can see on the bottom left-hand side, those are the spores. So in the spring, when conditions are right, that opening of that little pseudothecium, it opens up and the spores literally get shot out like cannonballs. And I've taken a Petri plate of medium that we know this fungus grows on, and we've turned it upside down over pieces of this woody stem tissue that's these pseudothecia have matured on, and place it about a half an inch to an inch above these woody stem pieces with the fruiting bodies. And it literally will shoot out these spores, and they get trapped on the plate, and then you've got your inoculum. You can grow the fungus. We can get pure cultures this way. It's pretty nice. Single spores you can isolate. But it shows you the inoculum is being released in the spring, right around the time that you're getting your new crop planted. And so if you don't incorporate your residues in the fall, okay, so unfortunately, this stage of the fungus has a different name, just to make it all confusing for you if you're not a taxonomist. Pleospora herbarum is the sexual stage of Stemphylium botryoosum. It's the same fungus, but it is going through the sexual recombination stage. So each of those 8 ascospores that is produced is genetically different because it's going through meiosis. So you've got a complicated population genetically, which means also a good survival strategy for the fungus. And the practical application of discovering this is that it's really important for our growers to incorporate spinach stem residues after harvest that fall and not wait till the spring. Because many of our growers will want to wait till the spring because the rains might start early in the fall and don't want to get out into the field. But then you are literally producing thousands and millions of spores for the next season. And if you happen to be planting your next season's crop across the road or across the windrow or across the fence line, that inoculum gets shot up into the air. Any little breeze or drift will blow that inoculum over to next season's crop. So this means that this practice of incorporating residues must be done regionally. It doesn't work if one grower does it and the others don't, because they're all, at least certainly in the Skagit Valley, where sort of the primary emphasis of spinach seed production for Western Washington, there's a lot of spinach seed crops around. They are isolated by at least half a mile because of pollination requirements, but these spores can be blown that distance. And so it's a practice that really needs to be done regionally, and we need to be looking out and making sure we all do the same thing. So I hope that helps illustrate this importance. 2 very different pathogens both cause a leaf spot. You'd think they'd be pretty similar, but recognizing they have very different requirements temperature-wise and very different survival mechanisms. So we can also try and manage pathogens by reducing inoculum through things like cover crops and soil amendments. In spinach, we have a big problem with fusarium wilt. It's a soil-borne fungus that is very, very persistent in our acid soils of Western Washington and Western Oregon. Our growers typically on a 10 to 15-year rotation once they've had a spinach seed crop in the ground, and it's all because of fusarium wilt. So we've done some research looking at mustard cover crops. This is a trial we did back in early to mid-2000s for 3 years, looking at if mustards could be grown and incorporated to help provide that biofumigant effect to reduce inoculum. And they certainly do reduce inoculum. We've also done some work looking at limestone amendment, calcium carbonate. It's, you can use an organic or conventional production. It raises the calcium level in the soil, it raises the pH in the soil, and the soil becomes less conducive to fusarium. We don't get rid of the disease, but if we can get that soil pH, which in our area is typically in the 5s, up closer to neutral, the closer we can get to neutral as possible, 7, the less severe our fusarium wilt becomes. So that's been really effective. But the combination of using limestone for a couple of years preceding a spinach crop, and then recognizing the susceptibility of some of the parent lines you're planting, we've been able to significantly reduce the crop rotation interval from 10 to 15 years down to potentially half of that, which potentially could double our spinach seed production in the U.S., because the only region of the U.S. suitable for spinach seed production is Western Washington and Western Oregon. That's it. So we, it's limited, and if you have these diseases that keep you on extended rotation like that, that's quite a problem. So I'm going to show you some examples. This was data from our mustard cover crop. We had metam-sodium, which is a synthetic fumigant, just as a control to see if you used a pretty harsh fumigant, how much would your seed yield increase? If you just look at the gray bars, that's seed yield. Then we looked at Brassica jonesea mustard cover crop, and you can see that compared to winter wheat on the very right-hand side, which is a common crop preceding spinach, you can see we increased the seed yield from just over 60. I don't have the unit of measure on the y-axis, sorry, but we did increase it up to close to 100. When we used a Brassica jonesea, Brassica hirta, which is an oriental white mustard mix, we got a similar level of increase. And we used mustard seed meal, which is a really concentrated level of these biofumigants. We got an even better increase in seed yield production for spinach because it was helping kill back the amount of Fusarium inoculum in the soil. When we're looking at this limestone work, I'm just going to give you a little bit of data. We've been working on this for about 8 years, looking at optimizing use of limestone to suppress Fusarium in spinach. This figure shows seed yield, marketable seed yield in pounds per acre. At the bottom shows the rate of limestone that we amended the soil, ranging from 0 to 4.2 tons per acre. And we had 2 different female lines in this field. Spinach is dioecious, so this was a female line. And you can see with a moderately susceptible female, you look at the seed yield, it went from about 1,300 pounds per acre with no limestone in the field up to 2,500 pounds per acre by putting on 2.8 tons of limestone per acre. That's pretty remarkable. But what happened when we went above that rate of limestone? Why did the yield just suddenly plummet? Well, what happens when you raise pH in the soil and you start to tie up certain essential micronutrients? And in particular, we've discovered as we've done this work, manganese and zinc turn into deficient levels. The plant itself, the crop, needs those micronutrients. So if you're going to use limestone and get your soil pH up to neutral when it's normally in the acidic range around the 5s, you do have to counter this with foliar feeds of manganese and zinc, either as a sulfate or a chelated type of form, because you don't want to deprive the crop of its essential elements too. And that susceptible female doesn't look like she responded very well, but that was actually equivalent to a 300% increase in yield, because when you're starting so small, it was super susceptible. But it just shows that if you've got that much disease pressure, nothing's going to get rid of that disease. But you can see how the limestone has really looked pretty promising. And we just had a PhD student finish up last year looking at optimizing use of limestone for spinach. And she went ahead and did a 4-year trial from 2009 to 2012. So 2009, she planted spinach in a field that had been out of spinach for 5 years, which normally would be suicide. You can see how low the seed yields were without limestone or with 1 ton or 2 tons. We got that increase, but still not great because 5 years is so bad. And then she came back in 2010, put limestone on the same plots at the same rates, 0, 1, or 2. The grower put a potato crop in the field. The next year, 2011, she put the same rates of limestone on. The grower planted a winter wheat crop. 2012, she came back and put spinach back in that field. So she had limestone on at 0, 1, or 2 tons per acre every year for 4 years. Or she put just a single application on the very last 0002, no limestone, or 2 tons just before planting. And look what it did to your seed yield. So getting a long-term shift in pH, not just a one-time shift, but a long-term shift, starts to affect the microflora in the soil, started to make the soil overall less conducive to Fusarium wilt. And we believe this is a very effective way to help double the spinach seed production in the U.S. by getting this disease to not take such a toll on spinach seed production. But
that's the resistant one?
Yeah, even a resistant female. And it's the same resistant female we had in some of the previous. Every year we've planted the same 3 female lines. And so we're very encouraged by this because this disease is our number one limitation for it.
So, but in 2009, your resistant one was still completely effective.
Because there was only a 4-year rotation out with a 5-year rotation with a single application. So when you put in multiple applications, you get a response. And part of the it's a complicated trial. I don't want to get into it because there's a lot more data here. There's a 300-page dissertation if anyone wants to read it associated with this work. If you want to know more about it, come and talk to me afterwards. I'd be happy to send you some work on this. But we're very encouraged that this is helping our growers make a big difference in managing this disease in spinach seed production. And it's really just to illustrate the complexity of managing soil-borne diseases. And some of these are not easy measures, but we can kind of work together to resolve these. I mentioned this issue of irrigation practice can make a big difference in managing diseases because of how long that leaf stays wet. Can sometimes make a big difference on how quickly a disease, a foliar, bacterial, or fungal disease might develop. Splash dispersal, relative humidity. I mentioned about drip irrigation becoming predominant form of irrigation in Central Oregon with carrot seed production because of bacterial blight. But the economics and the practicality of changing irrigation system is not always something that works. So you make the best of it as you can. And your timing of irrigation. If you water your crop late in the day, the canopy is going to probably stay wet through the night. So now you have a very, very long window of time when that leaf canopy is wet, and that increases the opportunity for that disease to establish more readily. So if possible, irrigate in the morning where you know the canopy is more likely to dry out before you get into the evening. That's not always possible when you've got a lot of crops to irrigate and you're moving your irrigation system around, or you've got a big center pivot and it takes so long to get around the field. So I recognize that these recommendations are quite easy to make in theory, not always easy in reality. And this is just to illustrate this as an example. We were monitoring Xanthomonas bacterial blight and carrot seed production. And you can see I've got paired fields down at the bottom on the y-axis. These are Oregon fields, that's why they have the abbreviation O in front. Field K, L, M, and N. Part of the field was under overhead irrigation and part of it was under drip. And then we monitored the incidence of plants that were infected with Xanthomonas in basically April, the yellow bars, June, the orange bars, and August, the red bars, which is just before harvest. So you can see the amount of Xanthomonas in those crops increases very rapidly as the temperature warms up because it's a very heat-responsive pathogen, loves heat. But you can see in almost all of those fields except for field K, the amount of Xanthomonas in the field was significantly reduced if the field was drip irrigated versus overhead irrigated. Okay, and that's just over the board. You get the occasional exception for other reasons that confound all of measuring this, but it's the reason 60% of or plus now of carrot seed crops are grown under drip irrigation in Central Oregon. Okay, so culturally we talk about planting practices. Sometimes if you can select your planting date, you can escape inoculum that might be blowing in, or if it's a pathogen that doesn't survive very well in our winters, if there's very cold areas, pathogen may come in later in the spring, and if you can get your planting done earlier, you might be able to get the crop established before the disease comes in. This is particularly true with insect-vectored pathogens, where the insect doesn't necessarily survive in your winters, like Vermont, pathogens that don't overwinter. We're selecting your planting date for when the conditions are unfavorable for the pathogen, but favorable for the crop. And with seed crops, unfortunately, this usually just doesn't pan out because you've got a limited time to raise your crop. The seed crops tend to have a longer period of production than some of your production crops. I mentioned the issue of row spacing, plant spacing. The wider the rows or the wider the plant spacing in the rows, the better the airflow. That obviously reduces your yield per acre if that's an issue. Space is an issue, so this is just an overall consideration. If you're struggling with a certain disease, these simple measures can make a big difference. I mentioned the row orientation. We've seen this firsthand in my own research trials. And other types of ventilation practices like thinning, managing your canopy for maximum air circulation. A good example here, it's not a seed-borne disease, but is white mold, sclerotinia, in carrot production. How many of you have seen white mold in beans or carrots or some of these other crops? Okay, and a very effective way of managing it organically in carrot root crops is to trim your canopy. So they have these machines that run down between the rows and actually trim the canopy, so to open up the space between the rows and get better air circulation down the rows. And it's extremely effective. It's being used more and more internationally and for carrot production, particularly organic production. Okay, and this is the photos I took in my field trials back in, whenever that was, 2003, when we accidentally had our rows going into the wind instead of perpendicular to the wind. And we were trying to create disease to test different treatments for a pathology trial and had a hard time getting this disease established. And we inoculated 3 or 4 times trying to get this disease to go. But we were right going into the primary wind direction, and the canopy just dried out like crazy. And I was new to growing cabbage seed crops, so I was trying to do my best to impress the seed companies and the growers that I could do a decent job growing a cabbage seed crop. So we were staking and tying like crazy, so I could show them I knew how to grow a cabbage seed crop. Everything I would do not to basically for disease control, and it worked really well. So I think it was a great illustration for me and for the growers. And this is the disease that we're working with, Alternaria brassicilla and Alternaria brassicae, both of which can be seed-borne. You can see here the disease in the seed crop and what it does to the pods. And it very readily seed-borne and very strong association with seed quality. So if you have infected seed germination will go down. And we saw this, there was a correlation between the amount of Alternaria on the seed and seed germination was a negative correlation of 0.89. You couldn't get much stronger than that. Okay, so transplanting and hygiene type practices, if you're doing a lot of transplanting, trying to avoid injuring those seedlings, that's always easier said than done. Avoid dipping those transplants in water if possible. That's a common cause of contamination if you're dealing with a pathogen that can be water dispersed. Sometimes pathogens can be transmitted mechanically. One of the worst cases of this is tobacco mosaic virus. And if you've got people on your farm who are smokers, the virus can survive in tobacco. And if you're smoking and then go and handle solanaceous crops, you can spread the virus on your hands. So common practice is if you have smokers working in your fields or in your greenhouses, is when they take a smoke break, they have to wash their hands with soapy water, warm soapy water, and that kills the virus on their hands and they go back and work. But you literally can spread TMV on your fingers if you're a smoker. Xanthomonas campestris, Pathobar campestris, and brassicas is a big issue for seed-borne, for production of brassica seed. One of the problems in cabbage seed production, those of you know this, is in the spring when those heads should be opening up after vernalizing all winter. If they're really tight out wrapper leaves, sometimes you have to go in with a knife and cut an X in the top of the head to help open the head up so the seed stalk can push out. Otherwise, it'll snap over. Now, what happens when you're cutting and you're moving from plant to plant? Okay, you're carrying sap from one plant to the next. And if Xanthomonas is in that field, that's a good way of spreading the bacterium. So again, this whole issue of spreading things, particularly if the canopy is wet and you're walking through the field and you're picking up the bacterium on your clothes and spreading it down the row. I mentioned this issue of geographic or regional location. Obviously, you grow on your farm. You can't just move your farm because it's a better location elsewhere for seed production. But this is the reason we do so much seed production in the US and in the western states where it's drier and less humid. Another example of regional location is brassica seed production. There's a lot of brassica seed production in western Oregon and also in western Washington. The Willamette Valley is quite a bit warmer in the summer than Skagit Valley because Skagit Valley is right next to the Puget Sound with cold waters. And it can be a 10-degree difference, maximum daytime temperature. And it's amazing how much of a difference that can make in black rot disease pressure. I get more comments from seed companies about black rot showing up in brassica seed crops in the Willamette Valley than in Skagit Valley. And part of it is simply that temperature differential because Xanthomonas likes heat. So it's part of the reason that Skagit Valley is a good place for brassica seed production is its lower black rot risk. Now, in terms of your own farm, one of the things to think about is things like frost pockets or areas prone to fogs or dews, right down by a river where you may be in a low-lying spot and fogs might develop. Those are all things that can help influence the disease pressure for certain pathogens in seed crops. So you might think about this. Are there places on your own farm that might be more prone to conditions that are favorable for diseases? And then, as I said before, spatial and temporal isolation of your crops within your own farm, if there's overlap in the host range of the diseases. This is a picture, Jody showed a similar picture earlier of Xanthomonas causing bacterial blight on the leaves and umbels in the carrot seed crop. One of the problems that we've discovered, carrot seed crops overlap biennially, by about 6 weeks to 8 weeks, depending on whether it's Central Oregon or Central Washington. When carrot seed crops are windrowed and then threshed, that material is extremely dry. And you see the bottom right-hand picture shows a combine going through and basically combining the windrow. And you see all the dust that's coming out of the back of the combine. Guess where Xanthomonas is going? Xanthomonas produces a gum, xanthan gum. When you eat chewing gum, the xanthan gum is what makes it chewy. It comes from Xanthomonas. If you didn't know that, it's kind of the xanthan gum gives it an incredible ability to survive sunlight, to survive desiccation, to persist in that very dried out state. So even though it's hot and dry, you'd think that it's not favorable for Xanthomonas, but Xanthomonas is in a nice desiccated state in that carrot residue. So we did a study where we drove a pickup truck behind combines, different distances downwind of these combines with an air sampler that you put Petri plates that Xanthomonas can grow on, kind of like the plate that Jody showed. And we could detect Xanthomonas in the aerosolized residue a mile downwind of a combine. Now, what happens with crops that are planted downwind for next year, downwind of that combine? And they're combining in September in Central Oregon. And we know now that this is one of the ways that Xanthomonas has become endemic in our carrot seed production region because of this aerosolized residue that's contaminating, being blown over to next year's fields, which are under sprinkler irrigation. Okay, 1 or 2 minutes, so I'll quickly wrap up here. Now, we did talk about chemical management of crops. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but there are certified organic products that can be used. Some can be very effective. Some are not necessarily highly effective, but might provide a little bit of protection. Some products stimulate a resistance response in the host. So they might not kill the pathogen, but they might help the plant be a little bit more effective in its resistance. Some really important things to consider if you are spraying a product or applying a product is when to apply it. I've run across situations where growers are applying the right kind of product for managing a particular disease, but putting it on at a time that's going to have absolutely no effect. So think carefully if you're going to be using a product. Are you putting it on at a time when that pathogen is vulnerable and is susceptible to being impacted by that product? And if you're dealing with seed crops, they often are very tall canopy, dense canopy. Are you getting that product on with enough volume of water to carry it down into the canopy where the disease pressure is highest? And that can be very difficult. One of the problems I've run into in central Washington is some growers will use aerial applications if they've got big fields. And what's the maximum gallonage you can carry in an airplane? If you're lucky, 10 gallons per acre. And you've got a carrot seed crop that's this tall, it's dense, it's going to go nowhere near the depth of that canopy where the product is needed. So think about this if you are doing a spray for something like bacteria or fungi. You need really good coverage to get it down into that canopy where the humidity is highest and the disease pressure is highest. Okay, just as this is an illustration of trying to control white mold in the cabbage seed crop, and we had a couple of Circle 2 organic treatments we were looking at. One of them didn't do a very good job in controlling white mold, but Serenade did help reduce the white mold by about 50%. This was a certified organic treatment. Again, making sure you got really good coverage, timing of the application, all of this was important. We did a carrot seed crop trial. This is my technician and a summer helper. We were sampling the umbels to see the level of Xanthomonas we could recover. We were looking at different products. In this particular case, we were looking at some coppers and some compost teas and a bunch of other things. And what we noticed, the only product that dropped the amount of Xanthomonas, so the lower the bar, the less Xanthomonas on the seed, was when we chemigated this copper product versus a spray boom application. Now, why would that make a difference if we put it on with a spray boom versus putting it on through the sprinkler? What's the difference? Coverage. Sprinkler's putting on a lot more water, same amount of total product, but it's carrying it down into that canopy, and the Xanthomonas pressure is higher in that canopy where it's more humid. So it was the only treatment that significantly reduced the amount of Xanthomonas we recovered from the seed. So coverage is really important. Jody covered issues of seed treatments. I won't go into any detail on that. I just want to quickly get into this aspect of disease resistance. Now, as I said, with seed growers, often you don't have a choice. You're given a contract. If it's a susceptible line, you're in trouble. But this is where it becomes really important to try and talk with the seed company you're contracting with, say it's high mowing seed. If you know you struggle with a particular disease in your area, or it's a disease that's predominant in your area, ask the seed company, do they know the susceptibility of that line that you're growing for seed? Do they know the susceptibility of that line to that disease? And I'm going to give you one illustration of this. Cucumber mosaic virus in spinach. It's seed-borne. It can be seed transmitted. we started seeing more and more problems with CMV and spinach seed production in our area. And certain companies were having problems with it and not others. And we did a survey and we looked at seed transmission rates, and we discovered that certain female lines had seed transmission rates as high as 60%. And in the literature, established studies that were published said that CMV was transmitted at less than 2%. But we found that certain genetic backgrounds, that seed transmission rate went up to 60%. So it became really important for the companies producing those genetic backgrounds to be screening their breeding lines to make sure they weren't carrying CMV along with them. Anyway, I'm going to quickly get to one of the things we did with spinach fusarium wilt. I mentioned our growers on these very long rotations. We're trying to manage this with liming. And we now have offered a soil bioassay to our spinach seed growers. Every winter around this time of the year, December, if growers are considering planting spinach in a field and they're worried that the risk might still be too high, they can bring us a 5-gallon bucket full of soil that represents randomly sampled from that field. We plant that soil out in the greenhouse with 3 female lines, susceptible, moderate, and resistant, represented by the green, the orange, and the red lines. And we can monitor the spinach in those fields. And the growers come and look at their fields in the greenhouse, the soil that they've submitted, to see how much risk there is of fusarium wilt based on the susceptibility of their parent lines. So in these 2 figures, these are 2 different years we've done this. We're in our 5th year of offering this bioassay to growers every winter. And you can see some fields that have very high bar. The higher the bar, the higher the risk of fusarium. If it reaches the top, everything died that we planted in it. And you can see that the risk varies depending on whether the female line that we grow in there is very susceptible or partially resistant. So as an illustration, this was a field, soil A, for anonymity that was submitted to in our bioassay. Everything died. Didn't matter whether we had a resistant female, a moderate female, or susceptible female. This field had been out of spinach for 15 years. It was still extremely high risk. This was another field submitted, and you can see moderate risk. So if you were given a contract for a line that had partial resistance, like the top line on the bottom picture, everything grew fine. But if it was very susceptible, everything died. So we now are using this to help growers identify the level of risk in their field, which they can then talk to the company and say, how susceptible are these parent lines you're giving me? Can I go back to that field? Is a 10-year rotation enough or not yet? Okay. And then just as Jody said, keep monitoring your fields. If you see a problem showing up, get an expert to come and take a look at your field or send samples for diagnosis to make sure that you can take the appropriate actions. Okay. All right. I'll stop there because I think we have time for questions.